Theodor Herzl wrote his classic work, The Jewish State, calling for a Jewish state in then Palestine in 1896. That was, of course, decades before Adolf Hitler's rise to power and the murder of 6 million Jews by the Nazis. And while the unspeakable horror of the Holocaust is what finally convinced the international community to create Israel in 1948, the Jewish state, the persecution, violence, and fear of diaspora Jews long predated Hitler's rise. For centuries and centuries, Jews across the world, particularly in Europe, lived in a liminal state of fear. The various governments that had them as subjects could turn on them at any point. And even if the state did not put them in the crosshairs, often it was their neighbors who did. The knock at the door, the mob with a list of names, the pogroms whipped up by demagogues marauding the streets, these were the elemental constant threats that stalked Jewish life on this planet for centuries. It is what brought so many Jews to our shores here in the U.S. in the great waves of immigration in the late 1880s. It is for this reason that the images coming from the streets of Israel right now are so morally shocking. Amidst rocket fire from Hamas and punishing airstrikes against apartment and office buildings in Gaza by the Israeli army, a bout of communal violence has been unleashed on the streets of Israel. Synagogues have been set on fire and Jewish businesses vandalized by Palestinian Israelis in the city of Lod, while mobs of young, angry Jewish Israelis have been organizing on social media and prowling the streets, targeting Palestinians they find in cars and beating them. I should tell you, the footage you're about to see is very disturbing, but it is worth watching. This incident happened in Bat Yam, Israel, where a crowd dragged a Palestinian man from a car and beat him while the news camera rolled. The Israeli anchors used the English word lynching to describe the mob. It was not an isolated incident. This sort of violence and intimidation has been documented in cities like Haifa, Tiberias, and Jerusalem. Israeli politicians, from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu on down, have condemned the mob violence as intolerable. In a video from his office, Netanyahu said, quote, "You can't take the law into your own hands. You cannot come to an Arab civilian and try to lynch him, just as we cannot see Arab citizens do so to Jewish citizens. This will not stand." For the last several decades, critics inside Israel and in Palestine and in the U.S. and in the international community have been sounding the alarm. And they have been saying the same thing, that the expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank would have the effect of destroying the possibility of a two-state solution. But more than that, they have warned, it would have the effect of functionally annihilating the conceptual coherence of the Jewish state's borders. It would channel the conflict inside with violent mobs now on the streets of Israel. That prophecy looks pretty prescient. Ula Jabril is a journalist and foreign policy analyst who grew up in East Jerusalem, one of the cities we are seeing this violence erupting in. Lisa Goldman is a journalist and co-founder of 972, a magazine that provides independent news and commentary from Israel and Palestine. Lisa, I just want to start with you because I've been consuming a lot of Israeli media over the last 24 hours, and it has been striking to me that there is a kind of genuine, palpable sense of shock to the conscience of these images of these mobs on the streets. And I wonder if you could just talk about what that has meant inside the conversation inside Israel and Palestine.
Wow, it's a very, it's huge. People are indeed shocked. I should say that these gangs are a combination of Beitar football fans. They're very like racist football thugs, soccer thugs, who are called La Familia. There's also settlers, radical settlers coming in buses and in cars, in groups to the West Bank, from the West Bank, sorry. Just general, there's a lot of racism in Israel because the Kahanists have become quite powerful in the government. And this is something that the chief of police actually said explicitly today, that a member of Knesset from a party called the Jewish Power Party, which is a Kahanist party, had incited a Jewish intifada inside Israel, that he personally had. His name is Itamar Ben-Gvir. He's a member of Knesset. He's a notorious radical racist settler. And has been inciting quite powerfully. And what you see now, by the way, is not particularly a reaction to Gaza. This is something that is There's been a lot of violence growing inside of Israel due to numerous factors that have to do with the inequality between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel inside Israel. But also there's, a lot of breaking down of the barriers that used to exist between Palestinian citizens of Israel, or 1948 Palestinians who are, as I said, citizens of Israel, and the East Jerusalem Palestinians who are stateless but have Israeli identity cards. Previously, there was the solidarity between these two groups was not high, and that has recently changed. There's a lot of solidarity that's growing, and a national identity, which is something that Netanyahu probably would have wanted to prevent. But he was so intent on cultivating the far right to shore up his power and his base that he has unleashed dogs of extreme racism on the streets of Israel.
Just for context, when you say Kahanist, that's a reference to Meir Kahane, who is a extremist right-wing rabbi who led a faction. He was actually murdered later in his life. He has been the sort of founding father for a lot of extremist elements in Israel further on. Rula Jibril, you grew up at Palestinian with Israeli citizenship. Your father was an imam in Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. You've written about the conflict for most of your life. What are you seeing now, and what do these images on the streets mean to you?
This is what we always been warning against, and we were appealing to Democrats in the United States, across the world, especially those who for all their life fought with African Americans here to affirm equality, equal right, and to protect multiracial democracy in the United States. What you are seeing in Israel is Trumpism on steroid. What you are seeing in the street of Israel is when you, like a Prime Minister Netanyahu, weaponized ethno-nationalism and belligerent racism and unleashed it in the streets. And now it's the dominant sentiment in Israel politics and Israel society. I never in my life seen anything like what we are seeing all over Israel in cities like mixed cities. Supposedly also tolerant coexistence was the character of those cities in Haifa and Akko and Tel Aviv, everywhere. What you are seeing is years and years where these nationalist extremists, the militias, the mob, the equivalent of the Proud Boys, were so legitimized and normalized, and now they're sitting in parliament. And they're Bibi's allies. These are people who will probably form a government. So he's been embracing these guys. So when our government in the United States says that we support Israel, they're asking the Palestinians who are occupied to protect their occupiers. This is what they're asking. In the meantime, they're actually sponsoring, underwriting the occupation in the occupied territories and West Bank, while underwriting, again, the ethno-segregation everywhere else. And the country is imploding. It's not imploding we've seen this gradually increasing, but it's imploding politically, socially, economically, and racially and religiously. And what I fear the most, you mentioned my father who worked in the mosque. In 1984, those extremist Jewish fanatics tried to blow up the mosque. They were caught, they were sentenced, and they were pardoned. In 96, they killed the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin. They incited against him. They called him a traitor of the Jewish people, and they killed him. The guy that killed him is now Yigal Amir, is a hero of these nationalists. We see where this rhetoric is going, and I fear it's going to be bloodshed, pogroms, and what you saw these nights, it's going to become the norm in Israel and Palestine.
Pray for that not to be the case. Rula Jibril and Lisa Goldman, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts tonight.